That was in Poland just minutes before I started recording this morning. Putin can feel his end is near, so he's escalating the war and attacking a NATO country yet again. You see, just this morning, President Trump tweeted this out, and this is something Putin cannot afford while his economy is crashing. Let's look at the tweet. A letter sent by President Trump to all NATO nations and the world. I'm ready to do major sanctions on Russia when all NATO nations have agreed and started to do the same thing, and when all NATO nations stop buying oil from Russia. As you know, NATO's commitment to win has been far less than 100%, and purchase of Russian oil by some has been shocking. It greatly weakens your negotiating position and bargaining power over Russia. Anyway, I'm ready to go when you are. Just say when. I believe that this plus NATO as a group placing 50 to 100% tariff on China to be fully withdrawn after the war with Russia and Ukraine is ended will also be one of the great help in ending this deadly but ridiculous war. China has strong control, even grip over Russia, and these powerful tariffs will break that grip. This is not Trump's war. It would never been started if I was president. It was Biden and Zelensky's war. It's not Zelensky's war. Ukraine was invaded. I'm only here to help stop it and save thousands of Russian and Ukrainian lives. 7,000 lives lost last week alone. Crazy. If NATO does as I say, the war will end quickly and all those lives will be saved. If not, you're wasting my time, the time and energy and money of the United States. Thank you for your attention. Definitely a great statement. It could be a lot stronger, but definitely a step in the right direction. At the end of the day, we don't have to ask NATO to come along with us. We can tell NATO to come along. Almost every single NATO country is not buying Russian oil except for Hungary, Slovakia, and Turkey. Now, Hungary and Slovakia are as pro-Russian as a country could get in Europe, and they're not going to stop buying Russian oil unless they are forced to, and that's what we have to do. So instead of asking them to stop buying Russian oil, we should be forcing them to do so. I think it's very disingenuous to name this as Europe buying Russian oil because at the end of the day, most European countries are not fan of the Hungarian government or Slovakian government. Now, the reason President Trump's tone is shifting is simple. He's realizing Putin does not want peace, and he shared this publicly just 2 days ago. Let's listen in.
So has your patience run out with Putin?
Yeah, it's sort of running out and running out fast, but it does take two to tango. It's amazing. When Putin wants to do it, Zelensky didn't. When Zelensky wanted to do it, Putin did. Now Zelensky wants to, and Putin is a question mark. But we're going to have to come down very, very strong.
Now, a couple of things to clarify. Putin never wanted peace. He pretended he wanted peace because he knew Ukraine would not give up territory, and that was his way of trying to show the world that it's Ukrainians who don't want peace. When in reality, Zelensky flipped the table on Putin. He said, hey, why not just meet and figure out the territorial dispute face to face? But that's something Putin cannot afford. You see, all this time he's been telling the Russian public, the Russian army, that Zelensky is an illegitimate leader. Now, he cannot sit on the same table as Zelensky and negotiate as if Zelensky was his equal, when in reality, Zelensky is a far greater leader than Putin will ever be. He wanted Ukraine in 3 days, and his army is still struggling 3.5 years later. In fact, in August, Ukraine gained more ground against Russians than Russia gained against Ukrainians. The army is failing and Putin's regime is collapsing. Let's listen to the plans President Trump shared as to how he wants to stop this war.
Before you move on, can I ask
More
you,
complex.
what is clamping down on Vladimir Putin?
Well, it'll be hitting very hard with sanctions to banks and having to do with oil and tariffs also. But I've already done it. I've done a lot. Look, India was their biggest customer. I put a 50% tariff on India because they're buying oil from Russia. That's not an easy thing to do. That's a big deal. And it causes a rift with India, you know. And remember this is a Europe problem, much more than our problem. The other thing I've done, Brian, and I know how you feel and very strongly about it, and I understand a lot of people do it, a lot of people don't, frankly. But we were spending $350 billion on a war that was across the ocean. Europe was spending $100 billion. It's still a lot of money, but it should have been equalized, at least equalized, or they should have spent more. But I did something. As you know, I went to NATO. great relationship with all of those NATO countries, and I got them to raise from 2% to 5%. And then I got them to pay for anything that all of our costs now are being paid by NATO. So NATO is very, they're rich countries, and they're now paying. We're sending missiles and things to NATO. NATO's paying us, and they're distributing to where they want, which is, in this case, Ukraine.
Mr. President.
Which is a big saving. That's a big difference. We're not spending, but
I heard
you know
they
what I want to do?
stopped, yeah.
I want to stop it for a different reason. Because now, I guess you could say we make money. I don't want to make money, but we're making money but I want to stop because they're losing 6,000 to 7,000 soldiers every single week. And they're not American soldiers. They're Russian and Ukrainian soldiers. And some people in the towns. But the big numbers are the soldiers. They're losing. Last week, they lost 7,018 soldiers. A little bit more Russia than Ukraine, but they both, they've lost 1.5 million soldiers fighting back and forth. I want to stop it on a human basis. Their souls, they're Russian souls, they're Ukraine, they're not American.
Yeah.
Now, let's go through point by point because he made a lot of different points. First one, of course, being that this is a much more of a Europe problem than the United States, and Europe should be stepping up, and they are stepping up. So that's definitely good news. Secondly, tariffs against countries that are supporting Russia work. Look at this. We put a 25% tariff on India for buying Russian oil and funding Putin's invasion, and Indian companies are actually stopping or actually hesitating to buy Russian oil. Doesn't matter what Indian government is saying, because at the end of the day, actions speak louder than words. And Indian companies have slowed down buying Russian oil. Now we have India's largest port operator banning sanctioned Russian tankers from entering its ports. Reason for this is simple. It's not just about companies that are buying Russian oil. You see, any company that's helping these companies transact with a sanctioned entity or a sanctioned country can face secondary sanctions. Meaning, if a refinery is buying Russian oil in India and I'm a port owner who's letting that refinery use my port to transfer that oil, well, guess what? That port owner is going to face sanction. That means he's going to have a much harder time accessing US dollar, the world's de facto reserve currency, and that port owner is going to have a lot harder time getting other Western tankers and Western ships to come to that port, because now that shipping company or those Western companies will face the same dilemma. If this port owner is hit with secondary sanctions, now if I'm dealing with that port owner, now I can risk secondary sanctions. Sanctions work, and they're playing out in front of our eyes. We need to double down, and we need to get more and more countries to get on board with these secondary sanctions against countries that are funding this invasion. This is exactly why US is urging G7 countries to put sanctions against countries like China and India all together. G7 countries include Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, and of course the United States. This Bloomberg report just came out, which states that US is urging these countries to impose tariffs as high as 100% on China and India. And of course, these tariffs will go away once these countries stop buying the oil. So this is not something where we're trying to ruin our relationship with this country, ruin our relationship with India. This is really just about Putin's senseless invasion. And hopefully these countries understand that. And of course, it's not just about China and India understanding this. We need European countries, G7 countries, NATO countries to understand this too. Because so far, it's only been United States who has tariffed India 25% for buying Russian oil. Everyone loves to brag about how US is not doing enough, but at the end of the day, US is the one that's actually doing something when it comes to secondary sanctions against countries that are buying Russian oil. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one right here. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that everyone should start a channel. But if you have ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel or a faceless channel, now is a perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions of dollars every single day, and it's pushing newer and smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure you have many questions on how to start and grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. That's why we decided to put all our YouTube advice into one YouTube video for completely free. So if you're someone interested in starting your own channel, You can watch that video here on YouTube by clicking the link in the description or card on your screen. Every country that wants Russia to stop this invasion needs to show Russia that we are united and we are willing to take action to punish Russia. And we are willing to take action when Russia does something that's out of line. Because it's not just European countries who are not taking action, it's also the United States. You guys remember how just 3 days ago, 19 drones went into Poland, a NATO country, and nothing was really done. Well, guess what? As I'm recording this just an hour ago, as you guys saw at the start of this video, another drone attack is being carried out against NATO countries like Poland and Romania. The sirens are going off. We don't have all the information because we're still getting it as it's happening, but sirens going off is something that did not happen last time. So just based on that fact, we can assume this may be something a lot bigger than what happened just 3 days ago. And the reason for this is simple. Russia was testing how NATO would respond, and NATO didn't really respond in a strong manner, so Russia is going to continue doing this. In fact, this is how President Trump responded after the drone attack against Poland. Not something you want to hear from the leader of the strongest country.
Will you condemn Russia flying drones in Poland?
Well, I hear that what happened, as you know, where they were taken down and they went a little berserk. But regardless, yes, I would condemn, even for being near that line. I don't like it. I'm not happy about it. That whole thing, I'm not happy about. I'm not going to defend anybody, but the Poland's, they were actually knocked down and they fell into an area. But you shouldn't be close to Poland anyway.
Right.
Events like these build deterrence. Depending on the action country carry out after something like this happens, it shows dictators around the world what the free world is willing to accept and what they're not willing to accept. If we don't do anything, it's just keep pushing this narrative that dictators can do whatever they want. And then it becomes a lot costlier to stop them. This is something we talked about with General Petraeus when he was on our podcast just a few weeks ago, and he could not stress enough the importance of deterrence and how small events can have outsized impact if we don't react appropriately. Let's listen to that clip.
That they cannot be rewarded for this first invasion of a sovereign country on the European continent since the end of World War II. And if you don't do that, I argue, and Andrew Roberts, my co-author, and many others argue, you undermine deterrence in other parts of the world. Keep in mind that deterrence is it's a product of the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and of your willingness to use them on the other. And if you don't help, again, Ukraine, if you don't help, say, Israel, our allies and partners in the Mideast against Iran, that undermines deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, because if you're not going to help your partners and friends there, it casts doubt about whether you might help, again, our allies, partners, and others that might be threatened in the Indo-Pacific. I was actually in the office of the Singaporean Prime Minister Lee, when the red line in Syria over chemical weapons use was crossed by the Bashar al-Assad regime, and the US did not respond in the way that we had threatened we would. And the Prime Minister rightly said, in my view, you know, General, that has repercussions out in the South China Sea. That has implications far beyond just what took place in the Middle East. Far beyond that region, it has implications out here in the Indo-Pacific.
And for sure, we'll talk actually about Taiwan and the island chains deterrence that U.S. has been building up in just a second, because that was definitely an interesting region, I guess, to say the least. But let's talk a little bit more about the future. Now, with Ukraine, we have had a lot of deals, right? We have the Budapest Memorandum. Then there have been a lot of ceasefires between Ukraine and Russia.
And of course, the Budapest Memorandum was signed by Russia, the U.S., and the U.K., as I recall, and Ukraine. And it guaranteed Ukraine's security if Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons that it had on its territory when the USSR collapsed. They gave up those nuclear weapons. We did not honor our end of that bargain.
For sure. And would you compare that a little bit to the same thing that happened in Syria, where we didn't respond to red lines? We're not honoring commitments we have made, I guess the previous administration has made. Would Ukraine trust, what kind of security guarantees would Ukraine trust moving forward if we do want to achieve long-term peace?
Well, this is one of the thorniest issues of this whole situation. because you'll recall the European leaders, in response to President Trump pushing them very hard to spend more on their own defenses, to spend more on helping Ukraine, and to shoulder much more of the burden on Ukraine. And that's absolutely right. I think President Trump did achieve something in that regard that no other president, and I watched many of them, very, very angry with their European counterparts. You know, I had NATO jobs as a 1, 3, and 4-star general, while I was also dual-hatted as a U.S. commander. So I spent a fair amount of time at NATO in the defense ministerials and so forth. And our defense ministers, our presidents repeatedly went after the Europeans for not achieving the 2% of GDP on defense that they had agreed to spend at the Wales summit well over a decade ago. This now is going to happen. In fact, now it's going to be 3.5% of GDP on defense, on actual defense expenditures, and then another 1.5% on infrastructure spending that supports the operationalization of the new NATO Supreme Allied Commander's defensive concept, because you literally have to move much further east from where the forces were back in the days of the Cold War, needless to say. So he has achieved something very significant there. That is great. But when the Prime Minister of the UK and the President of France got together with other coalition of the willing, the important NATO countries in Europe, they really never came up with what could be seen as a rock solid security guarantee. In my view, in fact, the only way you would have a rock solid guarantee would be if they put their forces with Ukrainian forces on the ground, on the front lines, so that if Russia breaks the ceasefire and commences additional offensive operations in Ukraine, that they will be engaged in that. They'll shed blood as well, and then you can see how they would then have to respond. That's just not realistic, though. The U.S. does have the ability, with its long-range fires and other capabilities, and you just saw that demonstrated, of course, in the extraordinary attack on the Iranian nuclear program. That really was the final element of that 12-day war prosecuted by Israel, and did so much damage to the Iranian nuclear program, to its security elements, the leaders, the scientists, and so forth. So the U.S. has that capability. The question is, could we make a commitment that would be seen as rock solid, on which the Ukrainians could depend to ensure that if Russia were to violate a ceasefire, which most of us think they will do, what they want to do is improve their position on the ground. They'd like to be given these fortress cities, that territory, in return for a ceasefire. But just as with what they did after 2014, when they seized the initial parts of southeastern Ukraine and Crimea, that they would then just stock back up, retrain, re-equip, refit, and then have another go at it to see how much farther they could get.